maybe before we start, we always like to kind of gauge the room. What are people interested in? We have about an hour for the panelists today to talk about open source, licensing, compliance, how to get this started or see where you are. Thanks, Will. Can I do a little test here? Like, who here is a developer? Okay, and who's a manager, lawyer? Okay, IT, and student. Yeah, who did I miss? Is that it? Okay. Great. And how much exposure to, say, open source licensing do people have? You say expert level, beginner level, nothing?
People know the difference between patents and copyrights? Okay, all right. They know some stuff.
Okay. So we're going to wait a couple minutes here, but we'll just introduce everybody just at the beginning when they start doing the recording here. And we have an hour. It's going to be a panel, but feel free to ask some questions along the way. If we want to push the question toward the end or toward after, we'll let you know. But in general, I think we're going to be open to most questions, especially if you think it's going to be something that's going to be of interest to the whole group here. If it's something very specific or kind of a point or law, we may want to talk about it offline afterward. We'll just let you know if that's too deep for the panel today.
And if people have jargon, like if we snuck jargon in that you don't get, tell us that one right away, because there's nothing worse than finding out we talked to you about 20 minutes
yes.
And you didn't even know what that thing was.
Yeah, ideally we're speaking to something that interests you too, right? So definitely let us know if there's topics that you're particularly interested in this area that we can help with.
How about who here is working in a place that has some sort of compliance program in place? Okay, and who here is working in a place that you're writing code, but there's no open source compliance program?
We're in
the middle. Okay.
Putting one in place.
If you're allowed to say.
If you're allowed to say, I'm going to take that as a.
Everyone else is not supposed to discuss this outside the office.
Exactly.
You won't leave the room?
Yeah, we will not turn the camera around, so we will not see you.
Yeah. Was that you, Steve, from the employer there? Really rampant violations. Okay.
I used to have to tell people that when I was talking about patents. I'm like, if you're going to raise your hand and tell me about your friend's workplace, please don't do that while we're recording.
Yeah.
Because I don't want you to get fired for asking a question.
I have a friend.
I have a friend at company who.
So I'll start.
Yep.
So my company, we have a embedded product, goes in cars and trucks, runs Linux, and we run our stuff on top of Linux, and we use some open source.
Are you using like a Linux distribution?
It's
building on top
based
of
on
it?
Yocto, so we are basically spinning our own distribution.
Yeah.
So I think we have some time at the end for, we're going to build up to like Linux and distribution models. So we'll start with kind of the beginning intro, and do you have a point that you want to hit?
My question is,
yep.
How do we document what are our responsibilities to our end users, to our customers, about what we need to provide them legally, whether they want it or not?
Perfect.
I think we're probably going to go through that in a slightly more general sense so that maybe everyone has a similar question can get the answer.
And maybe afterward at lunch or something we can get together and talk a little bit more about that. And I do have some slides that I think we can talk about as well. So let's start. It's a quarter till. My name is Jeff Lush. I'm the founder of Palamita, so I've been helping people with open source licensing and compliance issues since 2003. And I'm very happy to have 3 panelists with me today. And maybe we can go one by one and introduce ourselves.
My name is Deb Nicholson. I work at the Open Invention Network. So we primarily help people understand patent issues, although because of the nature of open source licensing, that often means we are talking about licenses and patents together. And I spend a lot of time convincing developers that waiting until next year or another round of funding is not the time to do legal stuff, that you should do it from
And I am an attorney from Hall Law. My name is Andrew Hall, and I do pretty much all things open source for really a huge array of companies, all the way from the small ones like Gradle. For people familiar with Gradle, that's one of our clients, all the way up to Honda and Symantec and Nike. So broad spectrum of companies. And I basically help them with all things open source, like, hey, we got compliance questions, we will need a governance program, anything open source. We basically come in and help companies figure it out, because as you're probably learning, there's a lot of companies where the knowledge of open source and kind of the rules around it are still pretty vague to a lot of companies. So we help them figure it out.
My name is Will Claridge. I'm a Senior Director of R&D Operations at a company in Portland called Tripwire. I have been at Tripwire for 16 years. 14 of those years I've been worried about open source. I've done everything from scripted discovery to actually working with Palamita for the last 6 years. My day-to-day life used to be the production of software, getting it out the door. Last 6 years I've been solely focused on the business side, which includes continued working with the open source software that we do use, and we use a lot of it, and I have to keep our company legal. I also do patents, and I've spent a lot of time on mergers and acquisitions. And if you're just new to open source and you work for a small company and you think that someday you're going to get bought for $1 billion, you want to make sure that your open source is in good shape. I've had my compliance programs vetted by some of the biggest lawyer companies in the United States during merger and acquisitions.
Yeah, we actually worked on one together at one point, right?
Yep.
They did acquire a client of the firm I was previously doing it for, and so I've done a lot of M&A as well, and definitely for a lot of clients, which is what you were saying, you should do it earlier, but for a lot of companies, when open source compliance becomes a particular issue, is either A, when you get contacted, and someone says, hey, we don't think you're providing source code, you should, or something like that. But the other big one is an equity event. If you're looking to be acquired, if you're looking for a big investment, it's becoming very standard practice to use something like Palamita to go in there and scan the code, and then you're going to have some geeky attorney like me show up and go, okay, tell me how you're using this package. Are you modifying it? How are you modifying it? All those sort of things. So the M&A event for a lot, especially for small companies, a lot of times will be the first big exposure to all these issues.
M&A?
Mergers and acquisitions, sorry.
Okay.
So if you're looking for someone to invest in the company, so you're either looking for a company to buy you or you're looking for a big round of funding. We need $50 million. We want to go to some hedge fund or some other company to invest. And they say, yeah, it's fine, but as part of our due diligence, as part of reviewing your company and make sure everything's up on the up and up, we're going to scan your source code. Palamita is going to tell us all the packages that are in there, and then somebody like me is going to show up and ask your developers about any copyleft software.
So let's first talk about, before we get into M&A and things like that, let's first just talk about the basics of compliance. Mm-hmm. So why are we here? We're here about open source licensing, commercial licensing. We're all, many of us are working at commercial companies who are trying to build products and respect all the laws. We're doing the right things around wages. We're doing the right things around ethics. We're doing the right things around X, Y, Z. When it comes to software, we sometimes have problems. And part of this is because it's in some ways a change for how we build software. It's been a change in the industry. Granted, it's been 20, 25 years now. It hasn't been just a day ago, but believe it or not, people are still struggling with this. I think that's why we're all here today. So maybe the panelists can talk a little bit about, when we talk about compliance, maybe that's a big word. What are we looking at in terms of, maybe Andrew, I'll start with you just because you're kind of taking the legal world, and then maybe Will and then Deb about how we see it on the ground here. So, Andrew, when you talk about compliance, tell us a little bit about open source. With the interest of we only have an hour here, but when you talk about compliance, what do people mean when they say compliance?
So generally, it's just that any time that you use software that is not owned by you, it's owned by a third party, or the IP covering is owned by a third party, the copyright or some patent, you need permission from them. And they can really draw that permission any way they want to. I could say, I'm going to license you my software, but on Tuesday you have to do 30 jumping jacks. I can do that, right? It's up to me to do it. And so with open source, they really have taken the typical commercial model, which was very restrictive. You're not allowed to copy it, you're not allowed to modify it, you're not allowed to reverse engineer it. And then you see the open source licenses where we're now giving the source code away and saying you can do all of these things. And in fact, in some cases, you have to give it back to code or something like that. But all of those things you have to do. All of those things are what we talk about when we say compliance. Are you doing the things that you're supposed to do under the license? Because if you're not, if I tell you you have to do 20 jumping jacks on Tuesday and you don't do 20 jumping jacks on Tuesday, I at least have a contract infringement claim. I might even have an IP infringement claim, which can be very, very expensive, especially the statutory damages. You probably all remember the Grokster cases where some girl was found to be liable for $1.5 million for 12 songs. That was statutory damages. And so there is a threat to being an IP infringer. And so it's really about, are you doing all the things that you are required to do either philosophy-wise or.
But also, I mean, I think it's important to note that for the software situation, the lost revenue on code you're giving away for free isn't going to be the same as it would be for songs where they expected that it would get paid. You know what I'm saying?
With statutory damages, it doesn't matter, right? So with non-statutory, if it's not statutory damages, so if I didn't file copyright or something, I have to prove to you how I was harmed. And so you're right, the actual harm is very low.
Right.
You can elect with copyright, if they've registered the copyright, they can get statutory damages where it's $30,000 to $150,000 or something per infringement. And they don't have to show damages. I don't even have to show us harmed. I just have to show you infringed. And that's what happened with the little girl. You know, certainly her 12 songs didn't cost $1.5 million to the music company. They didn't have to prove that. They proved she infringed.
But the motivation there is pretty different. Like they want to make an example to keep people from pirating songs. They think I don't want to lump people who work on infringement for software stuff into the same kind of black hat as like the
I'm not trying to
or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say they're comparable at all. I'm saying why it's expensive as an example of how it can be very expensive.
I don't want people to go away thinking like, oh, what if I use 12 pieces of code and then like my grandchildren are still paying off my horrible debt. And I think that's highly unlikely. That we don't. Luckily, we don't have super evil actors like that in our space right now.
And I think at the heart, I think that's a good point. I think at the heart of this is there's an expectation of I gave you something with some expectations and obligations, and as a company, we know in a commercial world, if we have a contract that says you owe me this money, you need to do this, commercial companies have no problem saying, of course, that's what I signed up to do. In the open source world, we can go down the list of this or that. It's in some ways I think kind of the same thing. The open source world says you don't have to call me on the phone to use my code, as long as you do A, B, C, and D. And sometimes they're going to be very easy to do. Sometimes they may be a little harder to do depending on your business model. But it's out there. It's written on the tin. It says here's what I want you to do. And when it comes to the lawyers about did you do the right thing, I think that's when we get into is it this or that, or you owe me this, you don't owe me that. But I think at its heart, it's the community is saying I want to share with you. But please follow these things, and that's all I need you to do. And if you don't do it, that's when you're out of compliance. That's I think when we talk about compliance. So maybe we'll when it so when it gets to your plate,
so it gets down to my plate.
Yeah.
So I work for a company that is trying to make a profit. We're a commercial company. We run our own intellectual property. We want to maintain ownership of our own code. So we're very, very careful about what open source we link with our software. And Andrew mentioned that we worked a little bit together several years ago when Tripwire was acquiring a company called Encircle. And that was an inflection point for Tripwire because up until that point, all of our software was just, software installer. You distribute it as one blob. We don't put GPL code into it because of the licensing restrictions. We're very careful about disclosing to our customers what software we're using that's open source and giving them the license agreements so that they can read through the license agreements themselves. But then we went into this realm of we bought a company that has appliances, and appliances have GPL code on it. And it's like, oh my goodness, there's the GPL code. So we had to get comfortable with what are the legal obligations to ship an appliance that has a Linux operating system and a whole bunch of GPL licensed apps on it. So I think it's important as a commercial company to make sure you understand what you're doing, get that baseline, and then watch that baseline over time to make sure you don't drift out of compliance.
And Deb, you've been, you work at the Open Invention Network. You also are, I think, a part of an open source project as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about what's it like being in an open source project and picking a license and then trying to have people comply with this, and what worked well to get that to work?
One of the projects I work on now is an AGPL project, which is the Affero General Public License, which people think of as the GPL for the web. So if you allow people to interact with your code on the website, then you have made a guarantee of source code availability to anyone who comes and uses the website. And then they're able to use that code, but then if they put it on their website, they have to do the same thing. And we, basically for us, that's a selling point. We wanted to build something that people would build on, and we wanted all of the stuff that people built on top of what we built be available and kind of grow the ecosystem of free software web applications. So it's very much at the top. Like no one comes into the Media Goblin site and like, oh, what's the license here? Like it's very clear. Like we're building an Affero GPL project where this is free software. When you contribute, when you put patches in, you are letting us put it under the same license that the rest of the project is. So there's no like, oh, can I put it in here or put it in with this other license? When people contribute, we let them know that this is going to go in with the same license that the rest of the project has. And I think just to generalize, like that's a pretty good practice, and it's considered sort of rude in the development world to spend time writing a patch and then be like, I'm going to put it in under a license that I know no one else in the project wants. And so that's a pretty jerky move. And so I think most people who contribute to open source projects regularly know that that sort of a hostile patch of a license that's different from the rest of the project isn't acceptable. And so, of course, new developers cropping up every day, so you do have to continually say all the time, this is what we're doing, this is what this license is. When you contribute, it will be under the license as the rest of the project, the same.
So that brings up actually 2 points. One is, as a commercial company, if I have a developer that uses a piece of software and they say, I got it from this website, and I go to that website and I look at it and there's no licensing at all, that makes me really nervous, because
that's default copyright. That's not open source at all.
yeah, that's just a copyright.
That employee has just basically stolen, and then that's the problem to you.
Yeah, and I've made developers take code out, have somebody else rewrite it greenfield so that we don't get any conflicts. I have contacted people and said, hey, we want to use your code, but you haven't put a license on it.
Please find a copy of the MIT attached.
Yeah. So I appreciate open source projects that actually very explicitly say, this is the license that we're using.
And best practices too, like I have a good friend who looked at a lot of packages for Red Hat for many, many years. And he said, I want a license header on every single file. I don't care if there's 3 lines of code in there or 300. I want a license header on every single file. And we were talking about it, and someone else who's like, fresh out of law school and is like, oh, that's ridiculous. And he's like, yeah, I've been doing this for like a decade, and
Put it on every file.
gets separated from the license file. If you don't have a license header on every single file, cut and paste. It's not, and that should be, for anything inbound, that should be best practices. Is always to have
I think that's a great point. We've talked a lot of acronyms here that may not be top of mind for everybody here. So MIT, AGPL, GPL. So maybe Andrew, in terms of how do you're getting on the phone with somebody and they say, I want to understand open source. What's your capsule review of the philosophy of licensing and kind of the major players there? There's a huge ecosystem, but what are the ones that people talk about?
And there are in fact, I think you guys always tell me there's like about 1,500 permutations of open source licenses. And in fact, there are so many licenses that when you're working inside a company or for yourself, anytime you're doing this, you really, especially if you're coming up with a governance system, you have to think scale. Okay, I can get 5 requests. How am I going to deal with that? What happens when it's 1,000 requests, right? But in the way that especially companies end up breaking it down is by a category of license. Categorically, what does this license require? And so the copyleft requirement, the requirement that I might have to publish my modifications or publish my combined code under an open source license, tends to be their biggest concern. Am I going to have to release the company source code under an open source license? And so licenses end up getting broken into 3 or 4 categories. You have the permissive licenses, which are like the MIT, the Apache, the BSD, the zlib license. And these are ones that pretty much universally will require some notice be given. Provide a copy of the license, provide a copyright notice, something like that. But they really almost never have source code obligations, and they never would require you to release your modifications under an open source license, release your combined software.
We like those.
Yeah. And those are the ones that every company's like, oh, you want to use MIT software? Sure.
Well, and to be fair, and we use the word commercial in one setting, like there are companies that are making great money hand over fist using copyleft licenses.
So closed source would be a better way to say it. If somebody has a closed source product, where they don't release the source code.
Right.
Or
They're gonna be
proprietary.
Well, so proprietary, or if if your business model is really focused around getting people to pay for each iteration of the software, yeah. But if your business model is around providing a platform or selling hardware, then or a web service, then copyleft may make more sense. So GitHub does great, Red Hat does great, and they're all GPL.
But as far as processing it, though, I mean, we generally have
Yeah.
permissive, which is just anywhere you want to use it, any way you want to use it. Most companies say fine, right? And at the other end of the spectrum, you have what we call the strong copyleft licenses, which would be like GPL, Creative Commons Share Alike, AGPL, which has a unique feature. But with those, it's anything that's a derivative work, which can be a fuzzy term, and it's not a real hard line necessarily under U.S. copyright law, but it potentially extends to combined software. And if you ask the publisher of the license, like the Free Software Foundation, they would say any linked strong GPL library requires that the entire thing be released under the GPL. So that's an example of where you'd be afraid, oh, if I link my closed source commercial product against a GPL library, am I going to have to release my closed source product? And so you generally just take, you pay a lot more attention to those licenses. You make sure your combination isn't going to cause a problem for you. A lot of times it won't. If you're just running a user app and you're shipping it inside a Linux build and it just runs in the user space, most of the time that's okay, right? But it just takes a little bit, a closer look. And then you have the middle, which is like the LGPL. We have the weak copyleft or file copyleft licenses, LGPL, Cuddle, Mozilla Public License, where you have to, they're designed so that you have to make your modifications to the code available, but they generally will allow you to link to them or otherwise combine with them without the linking software having to be published. The one other kind of interesting thing that comes up, you heard he was talking about embedded, she mentioned for the web with AGPL, an important distinction of almost all open source licenses, they're the vast majority of open source licenses. They are not triggered. Your requirements to do something are usually not triggered until you distribute the software. So if you're just using it at your house or something like that, most often you won't have anything you have to do, right? And so it becomes a big deal when companies are figuring out, as far as risk management and also compliance requirements, are we shipping it? Is it going to sit on an internal server? Are we going to use it for internal testing? Am I going to put it on a device? Because if you put it on a device, all of a sudden the LGPL becomes interesting because it can be hard to comply with. But you end up doing buckets, right? So you have buckets of uses, internal, distributed, embedded, and then you have buckets of licenses, weak copyleft, strong copyleft, permissive, network copyleft, AGPL. And you have to come up with some way to kind of process these all together. Come up with some system so that the developers know, hey, this is what I can do with weak copyleft and strong copyleft software, and if I do it, here's what we're supposed to do, what we're required to do.
And let's hold that thought for 1 second. And did you have a response?
Oh, I was just going to say, and this is, the bucketing is really great because otherwise you have a situation where every 5 months of code, like you got to send down to legal to I pulled this in, I wrote this, And if you just give people nice broad swaths, this is all go, this is all go when you're working here, this is all good when you're working here, and then it's good communication, but not constant every 5 minutes communication.
That's right. And developers don't waste their time, right? So I always say one of the first things you got to do is go in and train them because they don't want to request to use software that you're not going to let them use. Right? They don't want to waste time submitting requests. And so really once you train the developers, you get a system in place, it actually starts flowing pretty smoothly quite a bit.
And I'd like to go, so let's talk about education and policy. So there was just a lot of license talk and things like that where as a developer you might not know that GPL means general public license or AGPL means a Affero general public license. So let's maybe start with Will and then come down, Will, Deb, and then back to Andrew here. So Will, when you go and you say you have new developers coming on board and you say you want to communicate, you guys have a fairly complex licensing policy. You have proprietary pieces, you have things that are explicitly open source under the GPL. How do you communicate this pretty complex thing to your developers and when does that happen?
So we have a corporate policy that we wrote years ago that outlines for everybody what exactly what steps they have to take to get a license approved, and it's a third-party licensing policy, so it's not just open source, it includes commercial libraries that we may be paying for to go into the software, because you have to make sure that you're saying the right things about the commercial software when they ask you to. It's like the jumping jack. Some commercial software says you have to have a statement in your EULA that says you can only use this software for its intended purpose. So we write that as one line and we move on. So we started with a policy. It's a corporate policy. Everyone is supposed to read and sign the corporate policy. And then we have checks and balances throughout the process. The corporate policy says if you're going to add a library, whether it's commercial or open source, you have to email this distribution list and you have to give permission to use it. And then the library is looked at and vetted, and then approval is given or approval is not given, because you don't want to waste a lot of time with developers. And then we have checks and balances throughout our processes in the build systems, with build reports, with software like Palamita and other scripting that allows us to check on what the developers are doing to make sure that they're complying with the corporate policy.
And Deb, so at Media Goblin,
Yeah.
People come. How do you communicate to a worldwide development community what your expectations are? What do you expect when somebody comes in? And do you have ever cases where you have to help somebody understand licensing or policy or how to work in your world?
Yeah, so when we talk to people about the licensing, usually, I mean, like I said, for us it's a selling point. There aren't that many projects that use the AGPL, and so we maybe have kind of a self-selected group of people that want to come and work on our project because they're like, oh, we heard you were writing this AGPL thing for the web, and that's super exciting to us, and that's why we've come over here. But sometimes we do have to have conversations about, well, what does that mean, and that, as far as like what's on the website. So to comply with the AGPL, we need to make the source code available. So we make sure that there's a link to source on all the pages, so that's kind of how we do that, and we maintain a public repository. So for us, it's pretty easy to comply in that way. We have yet to have the situation where people are using our code and we think they're not complying, but I expect that will eventually happen, and that would be interesting.
And do you have the developers sign or attest or anything say? Here,
yeah, it's, if you push in a patch, then you should expect it to stay here and be under this license.
Okay,
Yeah.
so like a contributor licensing agreement or
we don't have
copyright
anything
assignment?
quite so formal. It's more if you by putting this patch in, you assume that it will stay in Media Goblin and be under the AGPL. And it's like we don't have to exactly be the copyright holder if it's AGPL. It just has to stay available on the repository.
And so Andrew, and so when you come in, as a council, and a company says, we haven't done this before, we know we should, we do the right thing with our toxic waste, we do the right thing with our employment practices, this was a hole for us, we didn't know what to do here. You're working with executives, maybe you're working with inside counsel, you're working with development leads, you're working with, what do you see when you have to, we can't, you often have an hour to do it yourself.
Yeah,
Where do you start? How do you want to get at a company to have them understand how to set up a compliance program? What documents do you leave them with? What questions do you have for them?
Yeah, I mean, so we have some standard documents we use or we'll tailor to a lot of our clients. So we do what we call developer, the cheat sheet. But it's like the front is a matrix of different licenses and uses, categories, the back is a list of licenses, and it's a way of saying, here, if you want to use open source, here's the likelihood that it's going to be permissible or not. What I focus on more and more, now that I've been doing this longer and longer, is efficiency and scaling. And so and the other thing I always want to do is, you also have to worry about buy-in, right? I mean, you're going to go to a bunch of developers who already have a lot of procedures and policies they have to sign and kind of be responsible for. And so I always go in and I try and figure out, what is your development process? Are you guys an agile group? Are you this type of group? Because what you ideally want to do is come up with some governance or compliance process that really folds into your current development process. There's no golden bullet, there's no perfect open source policy, because it's going to change by what are your products that you're shipping. Are you a SaaS company? Are you a device company? It's going to change by your company culture and the way you guys develop or the way you guys girls develop. And it will change by risk tolerance. And so, I mean, there are a lot of different things that can drive the policy. But I'm always just focusing on, what are you doing now? How do we do this efficiently? And let's boil down the process. I also there was a time when open source policies would talk a lot about open source software. Like they teach the developers about open source. You don't have to teach developers about open source. the policies I write get shorter and shorter. They're just process. It's like, here's some definitions. We go through the definitions of licenses. We go through the buckets of uses. This is what we call this use, this use, this use. And ideally, it's like 1 to 2 pages, like a cheat sheet approach, because otherwise you're just not going to read it.
Well, and for starting up projects, like we always recommend, like that you get business and development and management all in the room together, so that everyone agrees. Because if no one has told your legal department what your business model is, then they're going to recommend licenses that don't make any sense or restrictions that don't make any sense. And if your engineers don't know what your business model is, then you're going to have them wasting a lot of time on the work. And it's like, oh, I thought we were going to, oh, we're not? Oh, that's no good. And so we like increasingly just recommend like get everybody in the room together, so there's like benchmarks where they talk to each other and everyone's like, this is our business model, this is why we use the licenses this way, this is what we're trying to build, and what we want the outcome to be. So everyone's like on the same maybe 1 or 2 pages.
Yeah, for sure.
So Will, you're running this development organization. The policy is set, maybe from legal. You've had probably a view in it. The open source community's coming in. What are the problems that you see? Line level developers, people who haven't come to a conference like this, or people who haven't maybe lived in the open source world and gone out to Wikipedia or gone to FSF.org. What do you see, from the line level developer? Are they understanding the licenses? Are they aware of where these documents are? Like, what do you have? What are the challenges you have with the hundreds of developers you might work with? What's the spectrum look like?
So there's 2 challenges. There's the challenge with the developer that will just go cut and paste something off of a website because he has a problem. He Googled it. Here's a fix. That's great. Cut and paste. Put it in the code and move on. And that's where we use Palomino to catch him at that. And that actually creates some really interesting conversations I've had. Recently, I had a professional service consultant that slapped our copyright tripwire and a year on top of some code that we didn't own. And fortunately, we caught it before it shipped. He says, no, take that out, put the other copyright back, you got to do the right thing. So first is the developer that will go out and just copy and paste something in. Second challenge is the developers that think that they're doing the right thing and that they really understand GPL licensing. I've had numerous occasions where a developer asks for a library, and they'll actually send the email and say, I'm using this code, it's GPL, but it's okay, I used it the right way. And it's like, I'm really interested in how you used it, but bottom line, the answer is no. Because this is going into a project which would, if it went in, it would mean that we would have to open source our code of that project under the GPL license, and we weren't willing to do that. So we had somebody else rewrite that. But it's really a challenge with developers that understand a little bit about it.
Little knowledge is dangerous.
Yeah.
And people tend to be very opinionated. People disagree over whether loadable kernel modules are covered by the GPL2 with Linux, right? And people disagree over whether dynamically linking and creating a derivative work, or is the API a barrier? And the courts haven't really told us the answer, but you'll find people who are very certain that this is the right answer, and they'll just tell you, oh no, he's okay, dynamically link, it's cool. And it's like, wait, but from a company perspective, your risk management policy is we don't want to be the ones testing that border, right?
That's exactly the case. It's your tolerance for risk, and do you want to be the person that's going to test this out in the court of law?
You want
Right,
to be
and in the
VMware.
absence of any instruction from the court, you have to assume that what the community thinks the license means is more or less what it's going to mean.
Yep.
And that, because intent will matter if it does ever get tested in court, it's a matter of how much. And so it also, I think, creates other problems if you are, it's like the kid who's like, I'm not touching you. Like if you're doing that with the open source license in the community where you're like, I'm not touching you, then the community is still irritated with you. And so you haven't like won. You're just you're skirting the letter or what you think the letter is, which is not the same as acting within the spirit of which the code has been offered under those licenses.
And I think that's an excellent point. I think I very often see companies who, like you said, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and then they start to look and they say, how can we do what we want to do with something that we probably can't do it. So this is where we hear people start talking. If you ever hear the word shim or facade, so maybe you guys can talk a little bit about.
When we would get these questions, I used to work at the Free Software Foundation, and I would field some of the questions from the licensing queue, and people somehow, like, too many web pages had happened between fsf.org and the place where they put their question into the queue, so they didn't realize they were talking to the FSF. So they were basically like, hey, I want to link some stuff to GPL, but do it in a way that doesn't piss off the FSF. Like, so we are the FSF. I don't know. I guess maybe the GNU.org license email threw you off somehow. Like, but
it took me a while to figure that out.
Yeah. Well,
So that's kind of an important point. When you talk about risk, we have a lot of developers who use a lot of open source, and my tolerance for risk, when I look at the different things on my tolerance for risk list, one of them is I don't want to piss off the open source community. I started at Tripwire in 2000 right after they had made a mistake and got yelled at by Richard Stallman, and I inherited some unhappiness there that we had to fix and do a couple different things. So my risk tolerance list includes don't piss off the open source community. It also includes do the right thing. We want to be able to give back to the open source projects that we use when we find bugs. And so we're regularly, semi-regularly, submitting fixes back to the community, and sometimes they accept them and they come back around and we pick up the newer version. Occasionally they disagree with us and they say, nah, that's a problem somewhere else. So depending on the license, we have actually fixed a bug and then posted the entire package with the fix up on tripwire.com so that our customers can come and grab it should they need it. Because, like you said earlier, it's all about distribution. You can do whatever you want inside, but as soon as you trigger distribution, you have to start doing the right thing to the community and to your customers.
Let's talk about a couple things here. Let's talk about business models or distribution models. I don't always like the word business model because if you're an open source project, you don't really have a business model. You have
That's
a distribution.
not true.
Yeah.
Depends on which open source.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like everyone who works at Red Hat is eating fairy dust and living on oxygen alone.
Yeah.
There's no fairy dust.
Yeah.
Not
So-
that I know. But it's I think it's that's kind of not quite the right buckets to say open source and then business.
Sure. But that's why very often when we say business, people think money, and it's not always around money. So I want to make sure that we're not just talking about I'm charging for something. It's how we let people use what we're using, how we put it on the web, how we put it in a product, how we put it in a device. So maybe we can talk a little bit about business. Maybe start with Andrew.
How do you make money with open source?
Well, let's talk a little bit about software.
Everyone wants to know that.
That's a whole
That's the secret. That's this afternoon.
Give you the
And it's
lowdown.
fairy dust.
Let's talk a little bit about the classic model, distribution model.
Okay.
Like I give you software,
Okay.
and then let's talk a little bit about software as a service, and then let's talk about both Deb and Will here, kind of the open source side, and then kind of a blended model where you have commercial code and GPL software in the same product going out. So maybe a little bit about the various business models, and let's talk about.
Yeah. So, and I guess there are distribution ways of distributing, and then there are also kind of the business models which are a little different. But so from distribution, again, with distribution being such a key issue, the other one is sometimes you have these network copyleft licenses like the AGPL or the Creative Commons Share like 3.0 and later I think they became these network copyleft licenses. And with those licenses, if you interact with the software over a network, you're triggering these same obligations that you otherwise would have to distribute the software. And so when you're, again, kind of the buckets of open source use end up being, are you using it internally, like nobody from outside is going to be able to access the server it's on or the computer it's on? Are you using it in a SaaS environment or a hosted environment where it's in support of some service that you're providing over the web, but a copy is never going to end up on somebody else's computer? Or it's only going to be on our own AWS server. It's not going to end up somewhere outside the company firewall. Distribution then, we talked about that. And then embedded brings up its own issues. As far as open source kind of business models, how do people use open source and making money? The biggest way is to include it in a closed source product. That's still the biggest use of open source software. It's selling something that is closed source that includes a lot of open source. There are a lot of other ways to make money using open source. A lot of it is providing supporting services, right? And so anybody can go out there and get MongoDB, MySQL. You can go out and get your own, you can get Red Hat Enterprise Linux. You can get the source code. But if you need support, if you need people to help you set it up, if you need any sort of customization, that's where you want to go to the company and say, oh, hey, why not go to the company who writes 90% of this code to get this help? And so, like, supporting services is really common. What Amazon does, where they sell access to, again, kind of a cloud. They're selling Linux in the cloud. They're selling Azure in the cloud, right? They're selling people the ability to use these products. And so, not charging for Linux, they're charging for access or use of Linux. And so you see that quite a bit. You also have dual licensing, which you see with like MySQL. MongoDB does that as well, where I'll offer you software under an open source license like GPL or AGPL that might be commercially inconvenient to you. And then, you want to ship this software, and you otherwise would have to make the code available into GPL. Luckily for you, I have a commercial license that doesn't require you to open source, and you can take that one instead, and you have to pay us. And so it's almost like a freemium model that you see quite a bit. You also see a lot of open core, which is where I'm going to sell you a platform. Hey, Android, right? Here's Android. Android's free to all the handset distributors, everything like that. But what we do is we make money on the traffic and what gets sold on top of the platform. Or maybe we sell a proprietary plugin, right, that goes on top of the platform, but everybody gets to use and develop the platform itself for free. And those are some of the big ones. I mean, there are a few others.
Yeah, and there's some variations on that, having the free platform too, is that, you can, and they get combined, so you might say, I like this platform and you guys seem to be really good at building stuff on top of it. Can I pay you to build something for all of my employees to use? And so you see different versions of those things, or like where if you just have a service on the website and you make the API available, and that can be win-win, like sort of how Twitter lets everybody suck their data in and write academic papers on it, which is basically like 50-page advertisements for Twitter over and over again, which works great for them, right? Yep. So you see people combine like either like the web service or the ability to interact with the platform, and selling the service, the customization, the making different iteration or a different module, those different kinds of things.
I would say for the developers in the room, something to become aware of, and I work in San Francisco, I live in that bubble, so I don't know how prevalent this is, but very often, more and more, especially at these sort of conferences, you meet people who they work on a project. I'm an OpenStack guy. I'm this, I do this, or something, and like their employer is so secondary to how they think about these things, because the company uses that, they need somebody like that. But honestly, a lot of these, more and more I'm just seeing these developers, well, I'm paid by this company, but I basically just work on this open source project. This is what I do.
Well, because it's like, if you worked at a large company like Hewlett-Packard and you're a developer, you're not like, I can't wait till we do the all-company Christmas party. It's like, oh no, I can't wait to go to OpenStack. So they really highly associate themselves more with the project. And then,
this is really interesting.
And then you see people moving back and forth too, which is, it kind of goes back to the wanting to maintain community goodwill. So like, if you're one company working on OpenStack and there's another company working on OpenStack and you decide like, we want to sue you for patent infringement and do everything obnoxious that we can with all of the IP tricks that we have. And then you, maybe half your team leaves because they don't want to work there anymore. And then you're like, who could we hire that's really good at OpenStack? And it's like, well, everyone at this company despises you, so no one over there, I guess. And people remember that stuff. So they have ideas about like what is, what's acceptable behavior. If you're collaborating on something, like trying to be like, ooh, I caught you on a technicality is sort of considered bad form. And so, it makes it harder for you to, if you want to suck in more developers who are working on that shared project, and everyone's like, oh, we just spent a whole weekend like trash talking you over beers, like, yeah, we'll go work somewhere else. So it can be, it's really interesting as far as like the way the community goodwill plays into the way that legal behaves and the way it's it can be a big deal. And I think that's why we're starting to see more, like like at OAN, we do the mutual non-aggression pact. So it's like, hey, we're all going to work on this Linux thing together. Let's agree to not sue each other and not, trade a bunch of money back and forth every year and get really angry at each other and have a lot of news cases about how we're constantly suing each other. We could move on and do something else, like maybe hire more developers or, no offense to the lawyers.
Let me close up with Will here, and then I'd like to move to that topic, Deb. So, so you're working in a universe where you have closed source proprietary code you're shipping. You got Linux underneath. Maybe sometimes some, philosophies that are different there. How do you manage that, like the two worlds, a closed source world and a very open GPL world? How does that work in your commercial company?
It's walking a very thin line all the time, and you want to. It all comes back to limiting your risk, doing the right thing. Spent a lot of time talking with lawyers and brainstorming about what's good, what's bad, what does the community think about something. I think it was mentioned earlier that, if some of these things ever go to litigation, it's really going to be based on what the community thinks more than like one person thinks. So, forums that talk about how different people in the community are treating open source are often very important. But we walk that fine line between the open source world and the closed source world on a daily basis. There's things that you do on your licensing to make sure that you don't cross over with your intellectual property and have any cross-contamination. And like I said earlier, we also want to be good community citizens. So we fund a lot of things. I mean, we probably the best open source project name ever is the Legions of Bouncy Castle.
That's awesome.
I mean, David Hook down in Australia is, I've worked very closely with him over the last year because Tripwire is funding the FIPS 140-2 certification. And it's costing me or my company like $70,000 to do this. But in the end, it makes the internet a safer place with an open source product that everybody knows, that everybody uses, that everybody has been embedding in their own FIPS modules and getting certified anyways. It abstracts it out to a layer where you can just grab it and rely on their certificate. And it's funded almost 100% by a commercial entity, because it's going to cost me more than that to have my developers do it. I'm working with David, and my team's working with David, and we're paying arguably a lot of money, but there's a great benefit back to the entire internet. So when you're trying to work in both worlds, you have to find ways to support both worlds. So as much as possible, we support open source.
And I think that's a great point about being a developer, saying we could spend 5 people up and write our own crypto module, or we could look toward the open source world, best of breed, and do either direct donation, just saying thank you so much for what you've given us, you saved us money, or a pay for features. So we would like to support this development. So I think that's an excellent point that's often lost in these conversations. Like, I think as developers, we're able to talk to our management and say, I think I have a way of saving us money. I think I have a way of supporting the people who support us. If they disappear, we lose an important feature. And I think that's
we don't want any of the open source groups that we work with to disappear.
Well, and if you're paying to have one person working on it and sharing it so 4 other companies are paying the other 4 people, then that's cheaper than you hiring 5 people to write your own.
Yep.
And you hopefully also get the benefit of maybe slightly different culture and slightly different use cases that make the code more robust. So you maybe you don't have anyone in Australia, but now you know like how that code behaves in the other hemisphere with like different time zones and stuff, or different languages, or different use cases just because of the way people interact with the software. And so it's great to only have to pay for one person instead of pay for 5 and then have your stuff developed inside the bubble without any outside vetting or different use case added.
Yeah, exactly. I have limited ability to do double byte testing for Japanese markets.
Yeah.
Yet I can pick up an open source product that's used worldwide that has already been vetted for double byte, 18N type functions coming out of Japan already.
So we've talked primarily today about copyright and open source licensing, and I think there's some things that often come right after that, which is patents, which I think we've spent a lot of time talking about patents as well, and Deb gave a really good talk yesterday about her work. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about kind of the intersection here of open source licensing and patents, and then we'll continue along with the crew here.
Yeah. So the sort of the short story is that when we started trying to figure out like how would we treat software development under like where does it go? Is it copyright? Is it patent? Is it trademark? For a long time it was copyright because we write software, so that seemed to make the most sense. And then because of a couple different legal precedences, we opened up the scope of patentability to include a lot more of the things that we think of and build in software. And kind of, I think most people would agree we opened that up a little too wide for a while. And now we're seeing precedences through the court to try to narrow that back up to something a little bit more reasonable, so that you can't actually just say like, I'm going to do elementary school math, but on a computer. And then I got 17 pages of verbiage that make it sound like the most technically amazing thing since, you know, Cray supercomputers or something like that. And the courts and the USPTO used to be like, yeah, on a computer, that sounds fancy and technical, okay. And now we're seeing that narrowed back down again. But in the interim, we put tens of thousands of software patents on the books. We saw trolls using those software patents to, you know, just as a stick to beat people with. We saw companies that had a little bit of like, I wish we'd thought of that first, using kind of trollish behavior to bring software patent infringement suits. And then it kind of became this thing of like, well, if enough people in our area are suing each other, and then we're always paying, but we're never bringing in, like maybe we should get in on that. And then it kind of becomes this, you know, like the butter battle thing, right? So the Open Invention Network, we're now 10 years old. We decided like, well, let's get some of these companies that are swapping money back and forth every year, and let's just agree to not sue each other and see how that works out for a while. And that worked out great. And then because of the way everyone shares the code and the functionality involved in the code, so the copyright covers the writing and patents cover the function. But if we're sharing those, both the writing and the function, up and down the stack all the time and upstream, downstream all the time, then we need all the other projects in there. Also enjoying the not suing, also enjoying the not getting sued. And so we, instead of waiting for the legislature to do something intelligent on a technical issue, which could take a long, long time, we decided to pursue a community solution and self-organize, which actually has a lot of great precedent. People think the patent trolling is new, but if you go back in history, you can see the same issue with the railroads. Like the railroad industry got really mad. There was a couple of fellows that had patents on railroad stuff, and particularly the brake on a train. You can't have a train without a brake. And so this guy had a patent on brakes on trains, and then went and pestered the whole railroad industry and made them pay up. And so they organized together and did a lot of defensive patenting to get rid of that. So the organizing by industry to kind of take care of the problem of patent proliferation and frivolous patenting in your area has a good history. So that's kind of where we are at right now. There's maybe, I don't know if you want to talk about patent clauses and copyright licenses, or if that's going too deep. Or
And to kind of with OIN too, I think a great way to think about it is OIN is mostly around Linux and kind of the Linux middleware that goes with Linux. And so what they really are doing is what Keith Bergelt always calls co-opetition. And the idea is you're defining a sandbox where we're not going to sue each other. We're all going to say it's okay to use this software. Let's throw all our patents in. We'll throw it all in. And we all agree that in this box, we're not going to fight. Because what we all know is we need this box. We need this box. What we really want to sell, what makes us special, is what goes on top of this box. So why are we fighting over this fundamental piece? Let's all get together and not lose money on that. Let's all focus on making a great box together, and then we can then push all the other resources that we were spending on litigation and all these things and focus those on what makes us special. And so that's what I think. So it's almost like you're sandboxing a certain part of the stack and saying, we're not going to fight about this. There is, I think the fundamental tension with copyright and patents that you talked about is the idea that copyright historically protects expression. Like, I wrote a book, I did a painting, I wrote a song, and so you actually, copyright by definition does not protect functionality. If it's a functional element.
I can write it in Perl, you can write it in Python, and copyright's got nothing to do with it.
That's right. And so the issue becomes then, we have patents which are by definition protecting functionality, copyrights which are by definition not protecting functionality, but what makes software different than a book and a movie is that we don't appreciate software for the beauty with which it was written very often, right? Nobody pulls up a source code file and goes, wow, that's some serious good prose,
I do.
right? Right? But it's just, most people know it's about the functional effect. Like, that's what I care about. What's the function of the software? And so, of course, judges will, there's plenty of opinions where judges say this is the hardest thing you have to do is try to apply these rules to software. And so I think that challenge, because I think the sense is, among legislators, we need to protect this. This is very valuable, and certainly the companies that donate a lot of money say this is very valuable. We want to protect it, and figuring out how to do that cleanly with software has been hard.
Well, it's a lot of it's abstract, and most of the pre-existing doctrine around patents covers physical stuff. So, like, if I've got a pitchfork with 3 tines, and you're like, ooh, it's 1 less time, that's a great idea. And then you've got one, we hold them up next to each other and it's pretty obvious that you have copied my entire idea. But if I've got something running on my website, talking to a database and populating a page with certain kinds of information, and you've also got something like that going on, it's like, well, I don't know, maybe it seems like you might be doing precisely the same thing, but you also might not. And your website may be totally different. Maybe you're matching people with puppies, and I'm all cats over here or something.
So let's talk about where this often comes up for developers is when I'm giving patches back to an organization. So maybe if you're working at a company that's large enough that has a big patent portfolio, you start to use open source. You start to love using a particular package, and you say, I want to fix a bug or I want to add a feature, and the lawyer says no because we have this big patent portfolio. Why might that happen? And maybe if you can start with that, and then we can maybe talk about if that occurs at your organization. But why might somebody say you can't give that patch back?
Yeah, so there's definitely the open source and software communities in general, I think, perceive patents to be a threat, particularly because with copyrights, I can always rewrite what you've done. I can do it myself, and as long as I'm not inspired, as long as I'm not copying what you did, I just independently develop it, I'm okay. Patents, by contrast, if I have the patent over a certain function or technology or whatever it may be, nobody can do it. I don't care if you develop separately or not, I have the patent. And so you were at, so within software companies, and particularly this is really important to hardware companies, if you're working for a company that does routers or does something like that where there's a lot of patent activity, when you contribute software, very often, even under the Apache license, but under licenses like the Mozilla Public License, the GPL version 3.0 and later, they often now will include these explicit patent grants that say, oh, if you're contributing to this project, you agree that you grant a patent to everybody who's using this project, right? And so for companies that are in a very tight patent space and have to think very carefully about how they license all the technology around their hardware, they're a little concerned about the possibility of granting a license in a way that they otherwise may not have. I'm giving people the software, it's going to allow them to use the technology practiced by the software, and maybe otherwise I could assert a patent against it, but now I've granted this big, broad license. And so a lot of companies, particularly again, if you're in a patent-heavy industry, if you're a pharmaceutical company, this would be a huge issue for them if they were thinking about using open source or something. And so I guess that's the issue, is a lot of times we contribute. And the other thing is, because of copyleft, you can be a contributor, and that's what you're referring to. You can be a contributor without really knowing you're a contributor. So if you modify software and you distribute it, and what you've done is significant enough that it's copyrightable, under the license, a copyleft license, you are now actually very often a contributor, because you've distributed a modified version and you are now required to make the source code for that available under the license. And so there are times when just modifying a library and shipping it on could potentially grant a broader patent license than they intend to. And so again, when it always comes down to efficiency with me, the problem is you don't want to run a patent search on every single open source request that comes through. And so a lot of times when we come in, it's about helping and working with the company to identify, first, what kind of company are you? Are you a company that wants to maybe assert this? Are you going to try and get licensing fees through suing other companies and pressuring other companies? Are you a defensive company where all you're really worried about is, am I going to get sued? In which case you may not be as concerned about these sort of things, right? But finding out what's your temperature as a company, and then let's come up with a way, a lot of times, identify the technologies that are key to you, and then you flag the open source packages that, oh, this does that. This, we're really into cryptography. This is a cryptography open source package. We need to review this closer to make sure this works with our patent strategy.
Well, and it's really important because if you if without that patent grant, you have this like basically a honeypot. You know, if someone's like, oh, I'm throwing code in there, I hope you'll use it, infringe my patent, and then I can just go to the Git repository and get a list of everyone I should sue. Which I think most people would agree that that's pretty crummy. That's like that's like bringing a pile of botulism to a potluck. Nobody appreciates that, and no one
selling the vaccine at the door or whatever.
Selling the vaccine at the door.
Who needs Tums? $5 a piece.
Yeah, so you see where the idea of the patent grant comes from, and so it works well if you're in an industry that is, if you for Linux, we've got the sandbox around the patenting, so like maybe you don't have to worry about asserting your patents. So they work pretty well together. If you are like, yeah, that's not going to be our jam. We're not going to do a lot of patent assertion. So we can do GPL, and then we have like a list of thousands of companies that are not going to sue us. And that can be our thing, and we don't have to have our legal department be as large as our engineering department.
Yeah.
So guys, we have about 1 or 2 minutes here, and I just want to thank you very much for that. I just want to say, is there any quick questions, 1 or 2? We'll be available after as well. Any quick questions that you guys want the panel to address?
I had one obscure question. You said if somebody wrote thing in one language and you wrote it in another language, the copyright doesn't cover it, but isn't it like a translation?
Well, if you copied it, I mean, it's kind of, if your intention was to sort of completely re-implement it, then that would be a little less defensible.
It's complex.
Like in a black different room where you don't see the code.
Well, so you can do clean room development. That's what you're talking about. So that's the same thing. So if I take your code and I port it, that's what you're talking about is like a translation, and that will fall into a derivative work. So that would be covered by derivative.
And I often call that dirty room development,
right.
where the guy one here, like it is the antithesis of clean room. So.
Yeah, this is like if it had been independently developed, like there's versions of stuff to script through databases in all different languages, and stuff to talk to websites in all different languages.
So Will, you had a point.
So in that sort of case, I've had a developer try to use some software that I wouldn't approve the license for. So then we had a different developer who had not been involved go solve a problem without looking at this code, without knowing what was there and what was rejected. It's like, I need you to solve this problem, go off, take a couple days, write some libraries, and then come back to us. So we had like clean delineation of what knowledge was used, what was seen.
Yeah, and that's
Which is
because
great for copyright, but not for patents.
Right. So for copyright, you have to show that they copied or that they had access or something. So what you're doing is you're able to go in with a affidavit from this developer who said, I never even saw that code. I didn't copy from it because I never saw it. All I was given was a spec sheet, and then the spec sheet's not copyrightable. We looked at that, and I wrote it to the spec sheet. And so that's the independent development.
So we got one last question here.
So like if you're trying to copy an algorithm without knowing it, even if you copied it directly, if they're both Turing compatible, then it's no matter what you do, you're copying, right?
That's the patent side.
Well, it's Oracle Google case could make that a little tougher as well.
And I think we have a whole topic which we did not have time today, which is when you start doing compliance, very closely related to that is what's called remediation, which is we want to do the right thing, and guess what? We haven't been doing the right thing in certain areas, and how do we fix it? And that's clean room, that's re-implementation, that's perhaps relicensing. that's perhaps getting rid of features, and I think maybe that's next year's topic is how to deal with remediation. But I want to be respectful of everybody's time here, so I thank you very much, and I want to thank our panel very much for coming and being with us today. It's really good. And we're here all today. Many of us, I think, are here all day. If you guys want to follow up,
I have another talk after.
thank you guys. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Doug.
That was fast.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of other stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, he showed me a pretty good slide from the front. Yeah, that's great. So people touching on each point.
I'm Will.
I love that. It's good to maybe,
But we will. I think we are all at the same conferences one way or another.
For sure.
Close up here.
Thanks for coming up and whatnot. You, I think, had the shortest commute compared to everyone else, actually. So. I'm lead faculty for a program at Belgian College. We have our students take 5 credits, intellectual property, so copyright, patents, compliance, which is huge for a lot of our pieces. And this is actually all IT students are required to take this. It's a 300 level class.
Yeah.
Which actually team taught between 3 attorneys that are practitioners. But if you had to do a blind feedback, what would be 3 things you would want to make sure that we're absolutely in it?